This week, I'm making my submission for Benny's Spooky Edit War Reborn in Photoshop. The Spooky Edit War is a yearly competition hosted by the YouTube channel Benny Productions. If you haven't heard of them, go check them out. There's a link in the description. For the Edit War, all of the images are provided by Benny, and you must use all of them in order to create an artwork in Photoshop. The rules are simple. You cannot use any other images, the artwork must be Halloween themed, and some other stuff like certain aspect ratios and no text or watermarks. My wife is always telling me to enter one of these Photoshop competitions, so this year I did. This is the process of making my submission for Benny's Spooky Edit War 2021. I started by separating out all of the images so that I had them on a clean plate and a mask of them. Once I was done with that, I made a sketch and started to do some basic coloring. I wanted a giant spider and there were none in the images, so I had to paint it myself. So the beginning of this video is the process of me painting out that spider. When I first started this, I was thinking about world turtles that have cities on their backs, and I thought that might be a really interesting idea if I were to make it a Halloween themed thing. I tried several iterations of that and couldn't come up with something that I liked. So then I talked to my wife about it, and she suggested maybe it should have a house for a face instead of houses on its back. And this is the horrible abomination that came out of that idea. Once I started getting the shadows to where I wanted them on the spider, I decided it needed some hair texture. So I went and found one of the images that had the dried grass in it, and I thought I could maybe use that as texture for the spider. So this is me trying out that grass texture as a hair texture on his body. It was at this point that I decided he needed to have some hair that extended off his body. Normally you could just do this with a grass brush, but Benny had said something about not using shape brushes or complete shape brushes, and not wanting to break the rules, I just made this layer that I could copy and paste everywhere and manipulate on its body. After a few hours of that, I decided it needed more shadows and highlights, so I go back and do what is probably my final pass of those, just to get it to a spot where I think it's really good and ready to start manipulating with the other photos. Now that I have a finished spider, the entire next section of the video is going to be me bringing in all of the stock images, color grading them, cutting them out, doing whatever I need to get them to fit into the composition. It was at this point that I struggled a little bit. I needed some mid-ground grass, and everything in the photos, you have some really clear foreground elements, but the mid-ground is kind of lacking. So I took the same grass, repeated it several times, and scaled it down until it had the appropriate amount of blur as it would in a mid-ground element. And then I continued that through, created a tree, repeated that several times, and then made some bushes. So I've been working on these roots. I really wanted it to look like the house had been pulled up from the ground when the spider stood up. And it took so long. You'll see them kind of later in their finished state, but I just cut that, try to save some time. At this point, I wanted to find a fun and interesting way to use this pumpkin. So I decided I would go through and make a complete pumpkin out of one of them, and then try to turn it into a spider pumpkin. I wanted it to be kind of a fun little Easter egg hidden in the picture itself. So I make this spider pumpkin. I don't focus too much on detail because it's going to be really, really tiny. And then I decide to put it kind of in its lair in this pumpkin cart here, guarding its other pumpkin brethren. Just made me happy. With Pumpkin Spider done, it was time to move on to some mist, so I got my mist images out and made kind of a template for mist. I set that aside for later and started on all of the shadows that were cast down from this lightning strike and the sunset off in the background here. So I had always known that I wanted this spider kind of walking through a graveyard that was in a swamp. And this is the process of me making a displacement map that I could use to warp and ripple my reflection layer that I had just created there. Once the water was in place, it was time to start moving on to highlights and reflected light. You'll see I go through layer by layer and add some purple reflected light from the lightning and some yellow orangish light from the sunset onto pretty much every element in the picture. With highlights and reflected light done, I go through and add the last little bit of the shadows I want, kind of bring everything together. I bump up the shadows from certain elements just to give it some more detail and sharpness. And then I start with my fog again. I take that template I had, I tone it, I use it to separate multiple layers away from each other, and I even make some smoke coming out of the house. Then I do the reflected light from the windows, kind of the cast lighting, and any light rays that are coming out through the fog and smoke. I want to be real gentle with that, just because it's regular light rays are kind of blurry and foggy, and this is a mid-ground element. So everything I put in, I go through and kind of erase most of it back out, just leaving the hint of it there. Once I start getting everything finished up, I take one of the particle layers and I stretch it to make rain. And once I had rain, I decided I needed ripples in the water. So I went through and I generated a ripple. And then I made it super small and in perspective. And then I copy and pasted it about 100 times throughout that pool, changing the scale and size of it. And then I even went as far, you'll see later, as to make little rain droplets that are hitting the water, and then copy and pasted one of those hundreds of times and changed its scale as well. Adding the last little touches of shadows. And then finally I add some blur to the house and to the cart. Since they're in the mid-ground, I kind of want them to stand back just a little bit more and blend in with that spider as well. Once that's finished, it's on to camera raw, and here we have the final piece. The great, the powerful spider house. Thanks for watching the video. If you like what I'm doing on the channel, leave a like on the video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't. It would mean a lot to me. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave a comment. They help tremendously. Until then, see you in the next video.